It was the spring of 1987 when 27-year-old Delia Foss found herself standing alone in the middle of 940 acres of Nebraska cornland, holding a folded letter from her brother Owen that said, in plain terms, that he wanted his half. Their father, Roy Foss, had been dead 11 days. The ground was still soft from a late frost. The fields hadn't been planted yet, and the letter, written on a yellow legal pad in Owen's impatient left-handed scrawl, arrived before the funeral flowers had even dried. Let me set the scene for you. This was not a small misunderstanding between siblings. Owen was the older one by 9 years, and he had left Harlan County the week after his high school graduation with the kind of certainty that belongs only to 18-year-old boys who are sure the world owes them something better. He had gone to Omaha. He had married a woman named Patricia who wore blazers to Sunday dinner. He sold commercial insurance to feedlots and grain co-ops, and he had done well enough at it. He had not come home for Christmas in 4 years. He had not been there when Roy's health started failing. He had not been there when Delia spent 2 winters managing the farm alone while their father moved between the house and the hospital in Lincoln, back and forth, like a man trying to negotiate with something that wasn't interested in negotiating. Owen had not been there, but he was here now. His name was on the deed, same as hers, and he wanted to sell. The morning after the letter arrived, Delia drove the 12 miles into town in the old Chevy pickup that had belonged to her father before her. She didn't have an appointment. She walked into the offices of Meridian Agricultural Bank and asked to see the branch manager by his full name, because that was the kind of place Harlan County was. You knew everyone, and everyone knew your business before you'd said a word. Mr. Garfield was a careful man, in the way that men who manage other people's money learn to be careful. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that was professionally sympathetic in the way a doctor's office is professionally calming. He had known Roy Foss. Every banker in a 40-mile radius had known Roy Foss, because Roy was the sort of man who paid his notes early and never asked for more than he needed, which made him an anomaly in the agricultural lending world of the 1980s. Mr. Garfield offered her coffee. She declined. She sat down in the chair across from his desk and laid her hands flat on her knees and told him exactly where things stood. Roy's operating note had 18 months left on it. The equipment line was current. There was a small second mortgage on the east section of ground, taken out 2 years ago to cover the cost of a new grain dryer. Not new, exactly, but newer than the one that had burned out the summer of '85. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were manageable. What they were not, she told him, was a reason to sell. Mr. Garfield folded his hands and looked at her the way men of a certain generation look at young women who have just said something that surprises them. There was a pause in which she could feel him recalibrating. "Delia," he said, and there it was, the first name, the gentle landing. "The market for corn hasn't recovered the way we'd hoped. Your brother has a legal interest in the property. If he's motivated to sell, and you're not in a position to buy him out—" "I'll buy him out," she said. He blinked. "That's a significant sum." "I know what it is. I need 60 days. She didn't have 60 days worth of a plan. What she had was the knowledge that if she gave Mr. Garfield a number and a timeline, something in the arithmetic of the conversation would shift. She was right. He wrote the number down. He said he would need to see financials. She said she would have them on his desk by the end of the week. She drove home on a county road she had known since before she could drive, past fields that were greening up at the edges with the first volunteer rye. And she did not let herself cry until she was past the second windbreak and certain no one could see her. Now, let me tell you about Roy Foss, because to understand what happened next, you have to understand him. Roy was not a man who gave speeches. He was not the kind of father who sat his children down and imparted wisdom over the dinner table with the gravity of a man who knew he was being watched by posterity. His lessons came sideways. They came during oil changes and fence repairs, and the long, airless hours of detasseling corn in July. They came in the form of demonstrations that he rarely explained and expected you to understand. He had a saying he used so often it had stopped sounding like a saying and started sounding like weather. A man who borrows to grow is renting his own future. He said it the way other people said good morning. He said it when the neighbor to the south bought a second section on a variable rate note in 1983. He said it when the equipment dealer came out with the financing packages on the new 8-row planters. He said it quietly, not smugly. Roy Foss did not have a smug bone in his body, but with the flat certainty of someone who had looked at the arithmetic and found it wanting. He had farmed 940 acres with equipment that was, by the standards of the mid-1980s, nearly antique. His combine was a 1971 Gleaner that he had rebuilt twice with his own hands. His primary tractor was a 1968 Oliver 1855, a machine so old the parts had to be sourced from a dealer in Iowa who specialized in legacy equipment. He kept both of them in a state of near-perfect function through a combination of obsessive maintenance and the kind of mechanical intuition that is not taught in schools. He had a logbook. That is the only word for it, though it was really 3 wire-bound notebooks held together with a rubber band, the pages warped from years of being handled with greasy fingers. In those notebooks, in his small, precise handwriting, he had recorded every service interval, every parts replacement, every unusual symptom and its eventual diagnosis for every piece of equipment on the farm going back to 1961. It was the farm's biography, its medical history, its confession. He had taught Delia to use it before she was old enough to drive the equipment herself. He would sit her beside him on an overturned bucket in the shop, the notebook open between them, and walk her through whatever he was working on, not explaining what he was doing so much as thinking out loud, letting her follow the thread of his reasoning until she could pick it up herself. She had a gift for it. He never said so directly. But she noticed that by the time she was 16, he had stopped double-checking her work. Now it was 1987, and he was gone, and Owen wanted his half, and Delia was standing in the shop at 10 o'clock at night with the notebooks open on the workbench and a legal pad beside them, trying to figure out how to survive. The first problem was the grain dryer. The model they had, a 1979 continuous flow unit, the one that had replaced the burned-out machine, had developed a thermal cycling issue that Roy had been nursing through the previous fall. In his notebook, the last entry, dated October, read, "Burner cycling irregular. Suspect plenum thermocouple part TH4412B. Check wiring harness at junction box first. Do not run at full capacity until resolved." There was a small arrow at the bottom of the page pointing to the next entry, which was blank. He hadn't gotten back to it. Delia read that blank page for a long time. Then she found the wiring diagram he had taped to the inside back cover of the third notebook, and she went to work. Have you ever tried to trace a wiring fault in a piece of industrial grain drying equipment at 11 o'clock at night, in March, in Nebraska? The cold in that shop was the kind that gets into your hands and makes the fine motor work unreliable. She wore her father's old insulated coveralls because her own weren't warm enough, and they were so large on her that she had to roll the cuffs up twice. She traced the harness from the junction box with a multimeter, connection by connection, the way he had taught her, not assuming, testing. It took her until past midnight to find it, a corroded splice in the secondary control circuit that was sending intermittent false readings to the burner controller. The splice cost her $3.40 at the farm supply store in town. She replaced it the next morning. The dryer ran clean. That was the beginning. The weeks that followed were a kind of siege. Not dramatic. That's important to understand. The crisis of farming is almost never dramatic in the moment. It is a slow accumulation of weight, like snow on a roof. You don't notice it loading up until something cracks. What Delia was doing in those weeks between Roy's death and the planting season was preventing the crack. She called the equipment dealer in Iowa about parts availability for the Oliver. She called the elevator in town to renegotiate her storage contract. She went through Roy's tax records for the previous 5 years and built a cash flow projection on a piece of graph paper that she then took to an agricultural extension agent in the next county, a woman named Mrs. Holbrook, who had a reputation for telling farmers what they needed to hear rather than what they wanted to hear. Mrs. Holbrook looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she looked at Delia. "Your father ran a tight ship," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You plan to keep it that way?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Holbrook made 2 suggestions and 1 referral. The referral was to a federal loan program that could bridge the buyout if Delia could demonstrate sufficient equity and operational history. The suggestions were practical and specific, and Delia wrote them down and did both of them. Owen came back to the farm once during that period, on a Thursday afternoon in April, driving the Buick he'd bought the previous year. He walked around the place with the expression of a man doing an inventory he has already decided to liquidate. He looked at the Oliver sitting in the yard, the old gleaner in the machine shed, the grain bins along the south fence line. "Delia," he said, "I want you to be realistic with me." "I've been realistic," she said. "I'm buying you out. I've told you that." "With what?" "Dad didn't leave cash. He left equipment that should have been replaced a decade ago, and a mortgage on the east ground that—" "The east ground is fine," she said. "The mortgage is manageable." He looked at her the way he used to look at her when she was 12 and argued with him about something, like she was earnest but wrong. "You can't run this place alone. You don't have the capital for hired help, and you don't have Owen." Her voice was level. It was the voice she used with the equipment dealer and the elevator manager and Mr. Garfield at the bank. The voice that had gotten quieter as the stakes got higher. "I'm going to need you to trust the process. I'll have numbers for you by the end of June." He drove back to Omaha that evening. She went back to the shop and stayed there until the Oliver's rear wheel bearing was repacked and the seal replaced and the tire remounted, a job Roy had been putting off since the previous September because the harvest had come fast and there hadn't been time. It took her 4 hours. She did it by herself with a floor jack and a pipe wrench and the specific page in the notebook where Roy had recorded the torque specs. Let me tell you about that spring, because there are springs that are just seasons, and then there are springs that are tests. The planting window in 1987 came late and narrow. A wet April pushed everything back, and when the ground finally dried enough to work, every farmer in the county was trying to plant at the same time. Diesel was tight at the co-op because everyone needed it at once. Custom operators were booked solid. Delia had no custom operators in her plans and hadn't budgeted for them. She had the Oliver, the planter, and herself. She planted 940 acres in 11 days. I want you to understand what that means in practical terms. It means starting before sunrise and stopping after dark, 7 days running. It means eating a sandwich in the cab of the tractor and calling that lunch. It means checking your row spacing by flashlight at the end of the field and correcting the planter settings by hand before the next pass. It means a fuel leak on day 6 that you fix with a piece of hose and 2 clamps from the toolbox behind the seat because there is no time to go to town. It means discovering on day 8 that the planter's seed tube on row 4 has a crack, and fixing it with a patch kit meant for irrigation tubing, because that is what you have, and it works. When she finished planting, she parked the Oliver by the shop and sat on the fender for a long time in the early evening, too tired to go inside. The field stretched out in front of her in the last of the light, the rows running straight and parallel to the horizon, the dark soil showing the beginnings of green along the ridges where the corn was already pushing up. She thought about Roy. She thought about the notebook. She thought about how the best thing he had left her wasn't the land or the equipment or even the knowledge of how to maintain it. It was the belief that these things could be maintained, that they were worth maintaining, that the right response to a broken splice or a cracked seed tube was not to give up or buy new, but to fix the thing in front of you with what you had in your hands. The summer passed the way farming summers do, at a pace that would exhaust you if you thought about it and sustain you if you didn't. She grew corn. She watched the market. She kept the equipment running with the notebooks and the parts dealer in Iowa. And on 3 occasions, phone calls to a retired Oliver mechanic named Mr. Stovall, who lived outside Grand Island, and who had been fixing that model of tractor since before Delia was born. In September, when the corn was ready, she hired 2 local boys for the harvest, not a full crew, just enough hands for the grain cart and the trucks, and she ran the gleaner herself 16 hours a day for 2 weeks straight. The corn yielded 142 bushels to the acre on the home place, better than average for that year, better than most of her neighbors who had planted late and fertilized light because their operating capital was stretched. She sold the corn in 2 lots. The first went to the elevator at harvest price. The second she held in the bins until February when the market moved and sold then. She had done the same calculation Roy had always done, storage cost versus light improvement, and the numbers had held. By March of 1988, she had enough. Not comfortable, not easy, enough. She called Owen and gave him a figure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how she'd managed it. "Dad's way," she said. "Dad's way," he repeated in a tone she couldn't quite read. "Delia, I thought for sure you'd—" He stopped. "I thought you'd have to sell." "I know," she said. "A lot of people did." The closing happened on a Thursday. Owen signed his half of the deed over to her at the title company in town. He shook her hand after, which was an unusual thing for siblings to do, but it felt like the right thing for the occasion. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Whatever he saw, he didn't say. He drove back to Omaha. She drove back to the farm. That winter was a hard one in ways that had nothing to do with the farm. There was a stretch in January, 9 days straight of temperature below 0. The wind off the plains cutting through every layer. When the furnace in the farmhouse failed at 3 in the morning and she had to diagnose and restart the ignition system herself, in the dark, wrapped in every blanket she owned, using a flashlight held in her teeth. She got it running. It took 2 hours. But the particular aloneness of that moment, kneeling on the cold floor of the mechanical room with her breath making clouds and no one to hand her a tool or hold the flashlight, settled into her in a way that took a long time to lift. She was 28 years old. She owned 940 acres of Nebraska and a combine and a tractor that was 20 years old and a furnace that she had fixed herself in the middle of the night. She was not sure whether to feel proud this or sad about it. She settled, eventually, on both. There was a morning, sometime in that February, when she found something she hadn't known was there. She was cleaning out the last of the boxes from her father's desk. She had been putting it off for almost a year, and at the bottom of the middle drawer, underneath a folder of old warranty cards and a dog-eared USDA soil survey from 1974, she found an envelope with her name on it in Roy's handwriting. No date, no stamp, just her name, Delia, and the careful way he wrote when he was being deliberate about something. Inside was a single index card. He had written on both sides, which was unusual for him. The front side said, "The land doesn't care about your feelings, but it responds to your attention. Give it what it actually needs, not what's easiest to give." The back said, "You are the right person for this. I always knew. I should have told you." She sat at the desk for a long time with that card in her hands. She went out to the shop. She opened the red toolbox her father had kept beside the workbench. The same one, the same drawers, the same arrangement of wrenches and sockets that she could navigate by feel in the dark if she had to. She put the index card in the tray of the top drawer where she could find it easily. Then she went back to work. Now let me take you forward. 25 years to be exact. The farm is still 940 acres. Delia Foss is 52, and the lines of her face are the lines of a woman who has been outdoors in all weathers for most of her adult life. Her hands are the same kind of capable her father's were. Not rough exactly, but certain. She knows what every piece of equipment on the place is doing on any given day without having to think about it, the way you know the sounds your own house makes. She never did the thing that everyone told her to do in the boom years that followed the 90s recovery. She didn't borrow to expand. She didn't chase the cash rent market when land values were climbing and everyone was leveraging up. She had watched what happened to enough of her neighbors in 1987 and 1988 to know where that road ended. She bought one additional quarter section in 2003 for cash when a neighboring estate needed to liquidate quickly and the price was fair. That is the only land, she added. The farm is known, not famous, that's not the right word, known, in the way that a certain kind of place gets known in a county over time. The fields that always look right, the place where the equipment is always maintained, the operation where the corn yield numbers in a drought year make people look twice at the county average report. The Oliver 1855 is still in the machine shed. It hasn't pulled a field implement since 2001, when she bought a used tractor to replace it as the primary workhorse. But she kept it. She keeps it running. She starts it twice a year, once in spring and once in fall, and listens to the engine for several minutes with the same attention her father gave it. There is nothing functionally wrong with it. She keeps it because it is part of what the farm is, the same way the notebooks are part of what the farm is. The notebooks. She has added to them 3 more wire-bound books filled with her own handwriting alongside Roy's, the same categories, the same format, the same practice of noting every symptom and its resolution. She has taught the system to 2 people now, her nephew, her sister's boy, who started coming out on weekends when he was 16 and has a feel for machinery that reminds her enough of Roy that it sometimes catches her off guard, and a young woman named Perry, a beginning farmer from the next county who had been renting a small acreage and reached out to Delia through the extension office asking if she would be willing to talk. Perry stayed for 3 days. She asked good questions. She took notes in a small spiral notebook she carried in her back pocket. And on the last day, they were in the shop together, going through the service records on Delia's current combine, and Perry looked up from the notebook she'd been reading and said, "How did you know you'd make it? Back in '87, when your brother wanted to sell, how did you know you wouldn't just lose everything?" Delia considered the question honestly. "I didn't know," she said. "I knew I understood the equipment and I understood the ground and I understood the numbers. I knew my father had set things up so that they were survivable if you were careful. Whether I was careful enough," she shook her head. "You don't know that in advance. You just work and find out." Perry wrote that down. "The thing people misunderstand," Delia said, is that they think farming is about the market. Like if the corn price is good, you're good, and if it's bad, you're not. But the market is the part you can't control. My father understood that. He spent his whole career building the part he could control. She handed Perry the oldest of the notebooks, the one from 1961. Every entry in there is him controlling the part he could control. Every repair he made instead of buying new was him refusing to let someone else's profit margin become his expense. Every time he didn't borrow, he was refusing to let the bank's interest rate become his problem. Perry held the notebook carefully. The way you hold something you understand is old and has weight. "What do I tell people?" she said. "When they say I should be farming more ground, that I should be scaling up?" Delia looked at her. "Tell them your ground doesn't owe you ambition. It owes you what you put into it. No more." She took the notebook back and placed it in its spot on the shelf, in order beside the others. Owen called her that fall, as he did most falls now. He had retired from the insurance business 2 years earlier. His wife, Patricia, had passed the previous winter. He sounded older on the phone, more careful with his words than he had been when they were young, and he was certain about everything. "I've been thinking about Dad lately," he said. "Me too," she said. There was a silence on the line that was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence two people arrive at after enough years of smaller silences. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand now. What you did, what he built. I didn't understand it then. I thought I was being practical. I thought you were being sentimental." He paused. "I was wrong. I was looking at the wrong things. You didn't know what you didn't know," she said. "No," he said, "but you did." After she hung up the phone, she stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking out at the south fields in the late afternoon light. The corn was already harvested, the ground worked down and covered with the winter rye Roy had always planted, his small annual argument with erosion, a habit she had kept without ever consciously deciding to. The field looked the way it always looked this time of year, brown and quiet and already preparing for something. Her father had told her once that the land has a memory. He said it mattered what you did with it and how you did it, because the soil remembered. She had thought that was sentiment at the time, the kind of thing older men said to make farming sound larger than it was. She knew better now. She had watched the organic matter build in her fields over 30 years of cover crops and rotation and restraint. She had watched the yields hold in dry years when her neighbors' fields gave out. The land did remember. It remembered who had been patient with it. The index card from Roy's desk was still in the top drawer of the red toolbox in the shop, where she had put it 25 years ago. She didn't need to read it anymore. She knew what it said. She carried it the same way. She carried the notebooks and the logbooks and the particular knowledge of what a healthy engine sounds like at idle. Not as information to be retrieved, but as something that had simply become part of how she understood the world. The right person for this, he had always known. She went out to the shop to check on the combine before nightfall, because the day's work was not done until the equipment was seen to, and that was the only rule that had ever really mattered.